Now let's put all this together. You've got a bunch of people who haven't had a wage increase in forever. Their personal balance sheets are bloated. There's no inflation, so there's no inflation to eat their debts as there was in the 1970s. You can't put it on the creditor class. The creditor class runs politics and have never been more powerful, in part because of the inequality skew that this financialization and other processes has generated. There we go. Welcome to global populism. Your debts are too high, your wages are too low to pay off the debt, and the inflation's too low to eat the debt. The left response is to blame capital and globalization, and the right response is to blame immigrants and globalization. That's it. Now, from there, let's talk about party politics in the few minutes I've got left. So just read this one. In a group of 39 European countries, populist parties have improved their share of the vote in national elections to an average of 24.1% in 2017, up from 8.5% in 2000. And this is not just a function of the financial crisis. They have been around a long time. As I mentioned before, anti-system left parties have transformed southern European politics. Right parties have done the same in European north and east. Vote shares and turnouts for centre parties everywhere have all but collapsed. So how does that fit with this regime story? If you think about the first regime, what type of parties environmentally adapted to that? One where you have mass parties, one where you have real parties of social integration and mobilization that are tamed by post-war welfare states and become what Otto Kirchheimer called catch-all parties, whereby the game becomes move to the middle of the distribution, capture the median voter, and buy everybody off with public goods. The strategy of pushing out the possibility frontier of public goods hits the buffers in the 1970s in the inflationary crisis and destroys the redistributionary model based upon taxation and productivity increases, especially for left parties. Right parties never liked this shit. They were quite happy to see it go down, but it caused real problems for basically big left parties. What do you then see? A shift to what various scholars have called the cartel party form. You don't really want to do anything anymore because it gets you into trouble. You've been told by all your economists you shouldn't do anything because you can't do what you think you can do. So what you want to do is push trade out to the WTO. Get your monetary policy and give it to the central banks. Hand it over to the technocrats. Depoliticize it. Reduce the competitive space of party politics and create a cartel that agrees upon where politics should lie and what's beyond the pale for politics. That sounds an awful lot like what happened in the 1990s. That sounds an awful lot about the fragility of things like the Democrats just now, the Labour Party before Corbyn took over, etc. So you're truncating the supply curve of policy, externalising your policy commitments. You're competing more intensely over less. This is perfectly adapted as a form to the Bernanke Great Moderation world. Because ultimately, governing not very much is fine so long as not very much is wrong. But what happens when your risk optics are wrong? What happens when there's a giant leverage crisis brewing? What happens when you think you understand the system you're part of and you really don't? And then it all suddenly goes wrong and your party systems are unable to respond to it in any meaningful manner. Cartels over the long run, prior to the crisis, invent entryist. The vote share of the centre has been sinking since the 1990s. They've been gaining ground at the same time. The GFC simply accelerated what was there and provided both resources of mobilisation and culturally appropriate frames for people to understand the crisis, because the mainstream parties were unable to articulate what was going on, what was wrong, and how to fix it. Cartel parties today are what we're left with. This is the Democratic Party today. This is the SPD. They are, in one very real sense, the handmaidens, the constructors of the neoliberal global order. Always remember the quote from Mandelson in Britain, who said, "I'm perfectly relaxed with people in finance getting disturbingly rich so long as we get to tax them." The problem with that is it's an incredibly fragile business model, because if it blows up, you've got nothing left except the fact that you cost everyone their assets. So they have no interventionist capacity because they didn't think they needed one. They have no alternative to talk of because they were the people who said there was no alternative. They can't go back to fiscal policy because they enshrined monetary dominance. They privatised Keynesianism. They're dependent entirely on elites for funding. And they have no ability to shift their business model. So why aren't we all dead yet? Very simple. Because populism is the system reset. And there's a left-wing one as well as a right-wing one. We always get stuck up in the strum and drang of the right because they're nasty and we don't like their politics. But there's actually an enormous left-wing response as well built into this. The software's been rewritten, the code's been written from the ground up. It's just not in institutional forms that we recognise very easily. Second one, I hate to break this to people, but capitalism is anti-fragile. It gains from shocks. I have spent my whole life waiting for the crisis where it ends. It's not like that. It has enormous destructive capacity. It creates human misery on an enormous scale, but it also creates wealth on an enormous scale. And that means it's anti-fragile. It gains from shocks. This will continue.